Tonight, going back to Dorothea lecture, her title of the lecture is The Exhibition, a lecture demonstration. I'm not going to read through her introduction, but I want to introduce Dorothea. Dorothea von Hantelmann is a professor of art and society at Bard College in Berlin. Before taking the position at the Bard in Berlin, she was documenta professor at the Art Academy University of Kassel, where she lectured on the history and the meaning of documenta, and she was involved in constitution of a documenta research institute. Her main fields of research are contemporary art and theory, as well as the history and the theory of exhibitions. She is the author of the book How to Do Things with Art that I highly recommend. One of the seminal works on performativity within contemporary art. She was co-editor of the exhibition Politics of a Ritual and has written on artists such as Daniel Buren, Jeff Koons, Philippe Perreno, James Coleman. Her current book project is titled The Exhibition Transformations of a Ritual, which explores exhibition as the ritual spaces in which fundamental values and categories of modern, liberal, and market-based society historically have happened and continue to be practiced and reflected. Her curatorial work includes projects and exhibitions as I Promise It's Political, Museum Ludwig, Cologne 2002, Affective Affinities, Vienna Festival 1999, Theater Likes Me, Deutsches Schauspielhaus, that sounds like German, Hamburg 2001. She was a co-curator of a Prelude for SHAD, multidisciplinary arts project that took place in framework of SHAD, a new institution for arts in New York City, scheduled to open in 2019. Dorothea, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. A huge thank you to Diana and Katharina and Anna also, and to the Goethe Institute for bringing me here, but especially for Diana for being persistent. I'm really glad to be here. It's been a super nice and interesting day, and I felt very welcome. So thank you all for being here and for making the effort to come and hear this. As Diana said, my talk is a lecture demonstration. I will start with the lecture. You will experience the demonstration later. And it's a lecture on the exhibition in a quite general, but I hope deep and fundamental way, exploring maybe the DNA, or what we could call the DNA or the skeleton of this format, what I call the format of the exhibition or the format of the museum. And I will hopefully make clear what I mean by that. Have you ever wondered why Abu Dhabi needs a Louvre? Or why China, and I spoke about this earlier, a country with, as I'm sure you all are aware of, has a very rich tradition in theater and opera, is currently building hundreds of new museums. Imagine an archaeologist who, in a few thousand years from now, digs out Europe and the Western world, and in the center of each city, he or she will find a museum, a kind of temple in which people contemplate the meaning and the beauty of objects. And given the sheer quantity of these temples and their centrality in the city, and knowing that many of them were built by architects that were quite famous or well known at the time, he, she, the archaeologist, must assume that these places had an important function in their society. So what actually is this function? How and why could museums become so popular, so important to Western modernity. So important that they were even exported to other cultures. And it's not only museums. Until the 1950s, there were about a handful biennials worldwide. And in Europe, the Venice Biennial was the only periodic art exhibition of international importance. Today, about 200 cyclic large contemporary art exhibitions exist, from Sydney to Havana, from Shanghai to Istanbul, from Sao Paulo to Senegal, each of them with its own identity and geopolitical specificity. How could a relatively dry, and at least in its inception also rather scholarly event like the exhibition, flourish into one of the most successful formats in contemporary culture? We can approach these questions from two perspectives. The first one, which is also the slightly dominant one, I would say, is the one of art history and museum history, which looks at museums mainly as repositories for art objects. Art history has an obsession by nature or by its own profession for art objects, for artworks. So the museum is basically a container that hosts them. Museum history looks about museums in a historical perspective. So it's about the history of museums and the history of forms of display, forms of ways of presenting artworks. So this is the one way of seeing these places, and it doesn't bring us very far, I would argue, when in regard of the questions that I just raised. Why and how could they become so important and so popular? And why are they spreading worldwide? So the other perspective, which I think for us here is more interesting and fruitful, is that of anthropology and sociology, or even more specifically, social anthropology, which is more interested in these kind of questions and less obsessed with artworks, but more with the question of the museum as a setup. They meaning someone like Carol Duncan, who I'm quoting here, because she's the one who introduced the notion in reference to museums. She speaks of museums as civilizing rituals. So she introduced the term ritual in relation to museums, which I will also use a lot. She speaks of museums and someone, a sociologist, there's a sociologist called Tony Bennett who went into a similar direction. So Carol Duncan speaks of museum as a civilizing ritual, meaning that museums are places where values are practiced, such as civilizing people, which put the people much more into the center. Tony Bennett even goes so far to say that the objects are props for a work that is basically done to have an impact on the behavior, on the way of acting of human beings. I want to, from these people, I want to pick up the notion of ritual, because I think this is really helpful and interesting in relation to museums. What does it mean? And I think of this in a much broader sense than Carol Duncan with her notion of civilizing rituals, because museums are, yes, they are also civilizing, educating people in certain ways of behavior, but that's not all. But first, let us clarify what I mean with ritual. Because I'm sure you all have an idea of what a ritual is, but you might have different ideas, and it's actually not a very precisely defined term. Some people, when they speak of ritual, they mean something that is devoid of meaning, that is meaningless. It's only ritual. We do it, but it doesn't really have a meaning. That's not what I mean. I relate to the notion of ritual in a very basic, fundamental sense, meaning that rituals create spaces and times where members of the communicate, practice and act and cultivate, celebrate certain values or concepts that are deeply important for their community. Because these values, they could be religious, they could be cultural, are quite abstract. They need to be practiced, like religion is something abstract unless it's practiced. They need to be practiced, they need to become embodied in a ritual in order to become concrete, in order to be anchored in an individual and in a collective consciousness. This is what rituals are for. And these kind of rituals exist at all times and at all places. There is not one human culture that hasn't invented these kind of rituals. So again, rituals are places and situations in which a society cultivates its own core belief system, its own cosmology, you would say. So basically, my core argument is that every society needs these rituals in order to anchor and cultivate and practice its own cosmology, its own belief system. And museums become such a ritual around in the 19th century, first for modern Western societies, and then spread. The spreading part is something we can discuss. So, they derive their social function from the fact that they enact and embody very essential categories and concepts that are fundamental for modern Western industrialized, democratic, market-based societies. This is the function of museums. They do this by the help of artworks, but their power to enact this ritual is not alone and not even primarily rooted in these artworks. So I want to invite you to think of these places, also the place that we are in, as a setup where people and objects are arranged in specific ways, and the experience of these objects is staged and created in a specific ways, and to shift your perception towards this and away from the focus on the objects themselves. So this means to think of exhibitions as a ritual site. What does this mean in detail now? If we see the museum as a ritual that cultivates values and concepts that are very fundamental, very essential for modern Western societies. What are these values? What are these concepts? So the first one is the individual. Which is cultivated in museums on two levels. One is that they show works by individuals, artists. Not just individuals, but like we could say individuals in a higher extent. Like the individual that is even a little more individualized than the normal individual, which is the artist. So like the supreme individual. But it's not only that, which of course is not natural, you could say, or nothing universal, you know? I mean, other cultures don't, or in different times, this idea of the individual artist wasn't that cultivated. I mean, Heidegger, the philosopher, invents a completely different idea of the work. The work is something that the community produces, that a time produces. This focus on the individual creator is something very modern and very Western also. But the individual is also addressed on a different level. The individual visitor. Museums are the first, in a historical perspective, are the first ritual that explicitly addresses the individual and not a general collective audience like the theater, which, as we know, is the much older art form, right? And it was a huge debate in the first decades of museums in the 19th century if one could actually let people walk around through museums alone. And it happened, there was a slow transition. At first it was only in tours, so in guided tours, which is still somehow like a collective group that is guided. But the idea, I mean, you have to imagine that the idea of the individual in the early 19th century was something very abstract. But so it needed to be cultivated, and not just by the artwork, but it also needed to be cultivated by enacting, like placing it into the person. Like the Louvre opens around 1800. The treasures of France are symbolically handed over to the people, and they are individually allowed to experience them. And with this, of course, came the request to behave accordingly. So that's what Carol Duncan calls the civilizing ritual, right? You're addressed as an individual, you're now the center of the society, a modern Western society based on the individual. We address you as an individual. Kant writes his aesthetics at the same time, and he conceives of the experience of a visual artwork as something that is essentially a one-on-one situation, completely different from this collective body that the theater produces, right? We all come and go at the same time. It's a collective experience. It's thought as a collective experience. So if we think of museums today, like really big museums, like Tate Modern in London, having 5 or whatever, how many million visitors a year. 5 million visitors a year, but each of them goes their own way through this museum. Yeah? So the idea is it's open for all, but it's not the same for all. And this is super interesting in a cultural historical perspective, because it brings together 2 pillars of modern Western societies: mass access, open for all, and individualization, not the same for all. Everyone can come, but everyone is different. It's open to the mass. I mean, we all know that it's not everyone who goes to museums, but it's a huge number, and that's the large project of the last 200 years, opening culture from a very elite understanding of art and culture in aristocratic times to a larger population. It succeeded to a certain extent, you could say, when you see these places, also paying a price for that, but that's another story. So, opening it up to the masses without addressing them as a mass. It's not a football game. It's not a huge collective body. So something very profane and something that has very little to do with the specific artworks, but really with the format, carries a lot of meaning on this rich. And it's not that any of you is necessarily aware of that when you go to these places, but you participate in this, and you become enacted, immersed into the value system that is inscribed into this. So the individual, we said, is the first, but the individual in relation to a material object. This, again, is not neutral. The idea that objects carry this strong meaning and are worthy of our admiration is, of course, also a very cultural specific concept. And the idea that individuals understand something about themselves, about their history, historical museum, about themselves, about that they differentiate themselves, that they become more sophisticated people in relation to material things. I mean, to a material object. And of course, you could say that the art object is like the higher version of the material thing. This is a core nexus of modern Western societies, materialist societies. You need the object in order to understand yourself, to cultivate, to reflect on yourself. And of course, this thought style, as we could call it, emerges along with modern economy and with a modern materialist and productivist economy. It's not a coincidence that a culture celebrates museums that is productivist, and productivist means that it's a that societies measure their own wealth and their own status according to how much they produce, which again is not universal. I mean, you could also measure a society along its peacefulness or other things. But I mean, these societies that generate museums are growth societies. I mean, economically driven by the principle of growth, right? And that is the kind of the premise of productivism. So it's not a coincidence that a society that measures itself according to what it produces, a productivist society, in which the idea of a good life runs along the production of objects, dedicates so much significance to a cultural ritual like the museum that is also centered on the value and significance of material objects. So the individual, the material object, which is the core. I mean, the producing individual is the core of the society, and the artist producing an artwork is like bringing this core to a higher level of sophistication. So the third is immersing this nexus, the individual, the object, into a narrative of progress. You go through a museum, you start at an early time, you end at your presence. I mean, this is a very basic narrative that until this day, most museums follow. We can later speak about new forms maybe of narrative. And of course this idea that culture has a timeline and that it's about situating us in a timeline. And this timeline is not a neutral timeline, but things are getting better. There's an ideology inscribed that progress, again, is not neutral. And it's also not just culturally significant, but deeply economically significant. In the 19th century, where museums emerged, the credit system, like the principle of growth, is economically based on the credit system. The credit system is based on the belief that the future is bringing benefits, right? You only invest economically in a credit when you think that it's worth it. You invest in the future, basically. So you need a belief in the future. So individually, but also collectively, this idea of a timeline, this idea of of progress, of development, of an evolutionary understanding of time, was extremely important, also economically. And the fourth pillar is the idea of the market. With these objects entering museums and leaving their previous context, be it the church or the court or whatever, they become also part of the market economy. So structurally, these artworks are goods. I mean, refined goods, we could say, with Werner Sombart, who's a German sociologist who coined that phrase. So structurally, they are products and form part of the market economy, which is why Boris Kreuz, I don't know if you know him, art historian, calls museums preschools of consumption. So, the individual, the material object, a narrative of progress, and the product. These are basically the building blocks of the modern socioeconomic order. And the museum is the place that brings them into a certain relation to each other by the help of artworks and visitors. So again, it is the format itself that carries, that embodies the social and the economic and the intellectual mindset of modernity. It doesn't need to be, I mean, and whether you exhibit an artist who's against all this or not, doesn't really matter, unfortunately. To the opposite, I mean, there's no better propaganda than critique. I mean, that's part of this, the liberal aspect of this, the liberal mindset is part of that. We come to this later, that it can host everything, even critique. But the format is what is really strong, and the format is also that which is exported, right? I mean, it's not necessarily a certain group of artists that show up. A certain form of aesthetics. It's a certain format that is exported. A format which is also very strong and very powerful, as I said, and not easy to change, and we'll come to that later. I was thinking about, how am I doing time-wise? I was asking for a label earlier, because you can actually already see in the label. I mean, I can see anything because half of it is in language I don't speak, but maybe, I mean, it starts with the name of the artist, right? And the name of the artist points to this idea of individualization. I said this before. Then comes the title of the, well, then actually the dates, the dates of the artist. But then the title, right? Rocky Desert. The title of a work. I mean, it seems so neutral. It seems so purely informative, but it's not. I mean, the idea that an artwork is a distinct entity that can be separated from other objects or from forms of use or context, that it's a distinct thing, and therefore also needs a title, points to a very Western modern understanding of objects. Like in other cultures where you think of objects as part of networks or part of associations, it would completely make no sense. And then the years when it's produced, only a productivist society, only a society with this kind of profane idea of timeline would be interested in knowing this. And finally, the technique. And this is, of course, the productivist society that is interested in these details of technological production. For other cultures, this wouldn't make sense. And often, I mean, this is part of the collection here, this is why it's not mentioned, but in other exhibitions, it's the last is usually the owner, or the donor, right? And this, of course, is also extremely interesting, because it's this idea that ownership is so important is, again, a very, I mean, it exists in many cultures, but I think in no cultures it's so celebrated as in, or cultivated as in a Western, right? So just this simple, supposedly meaningless thing carries the mindset. I mean, just with this, we are sort of in the midst of Western liberalism, right? It's by no way is it a meaningless, neutral thing. And this is actually why I'm interested in these places, because their structure represents the structure of societies. And when we look at a museum around 1800, we understand the society of that time. And the same accounts for the museum in 1900 or for the museum in 2018. And this is why it's interesting to study these institutions, I think. They share the same DNA as these societies, and this is the reason for their success. Not because the artists are so wonderful, I mean, this also, but the core for this success story, or because museums are so amazingly joyful, I mean, no, but the core of the success story of this format is the fact that it shares the DNA of this socio-economic order that is also exported, which also means that, so the fact that they share the DNA also means that to the extent that these societies, that Western societies understand themselves as essentially open societies, as societies that are constantly changing, transforming, also means that this ritual has to stay relatively open and open to constant adjustments and changes. But not just any changes. Changes that march in step, that correspond to the changes of the socioeconomic order. It's extremely interesting. We can understand the whole history of individualization, the idea of the persons becoming more and more individuals, by measuring the increase of wall space in painting exhibitions. Like in early 19th century museum, it's like you know, salon style. Like the wall is full, and you see so it's completely corresponding on these pictures. You see like the wall is completely full with images, with paintings, like from bottom to top, and it's a lot of people inside, and they are largely in big groups, and they are not individualized. They're all the same. And then you compare it with the late 20th century white cube. One picture, one image, one person. It's from decade to decade, it's becoming more cleared up. And the same goes for, I mean, this is more like a field of research, but for this so-called contemporary experience societies, you know, societies that are more and more attuned, focused on creating like an economy that shifts away from being a productivist society economy to an economy that is more service-oriented and experience and lifestyle-oriented, which goes along with the complete increase of the idea of experience also in art and the art context, experiential spaces, experiential artworks and so on. Okay, I think at this moment I would like to stop here, and for the second part of my presentation, which, as I said, is more a demonstration than a lecture, ask you all to go with me to this part over there. So if you would all get up and walk over there, would be great. And if someone could help me with the table here, that would be wonderful. Okay. Explain to you what I'm doing here. First of all, I have to instruct my assistants. Yes. Right. Is it like this? Yes. Okay. Let me do first. So what am I doing here? I'm installing a little exhibition with the things that I needed to do my lecture with, which is the microphone. I worked very hard on getting this microphone because they seem to be not so common here, but it's so. Oops. And the water gas goes over here. My manuscript here. This I mean, it's not the greatest exhibition in the world. Sorry for that.
It's free. We are not paying the ticket for it.
But it's also, as I said, would you hold this for a second? Because I have to do something here which I can't do. Taking this apart. Thank you.
Am I a co-curator now?
Yeah, well, getting there. Ed, you want to be a co-curator?
If you appoint me.
Okay, I have something for you to do.
Alright.
Wait a moment. No, you can stay there, I'll come. I'm still... Okay, so I'll let you curate something. You can...
You hold it there.
No, you don't hold it. So, like in the 90s, you know, contemporary art exhibitions, there would be things like this on the floor. Just drop it.
No, wait a minute.
You don't want to do this?
No, I will lie on the floor and I'll hold it.
Well, that's performance art. That's what I want to do.
Okay, well,
You want to do this? You want to? Yeah, but let's see where. Could we? You have to stand there.
No.
Could we? Because then we could maybe place it. Oh no, let's do it
The
here.
cleanest part is under the staircase because nobody walks there.
Yeah, that's
Toss it under the second.
yeah, but it's not about being clean.
Okay,
It's
alright.
aesthetics. We're now in the realm of aesthetics.
Okay,
So maybe here.
alright.
Thank you. It's better if we cannot read the label, no, because that's producing too much.
The label is very chic.
Yeah, but no matter what it is, it produces meaning, and we have to be conscious about. This is okay. Good.
But it's too anthropomorphic.
It's
It's too anthropomorphic. It should lose its identity as an object.
Is that a problem? You see, this is cute. I mean, we have, everything becomes meaningful all of a sudden, which is partly Duchamp's fault, no? Yeah, anyway, we'll leave it like this. So, thank you. Let's start with this beautiful object. I love it that it's writing. So, what has changed in relation to the objects? I mean, we look at them differently. We start developing a particular kind of curiosity, let's say, towards these things. We look at them, a particular kind of attention maybe. We look at them, we start looking at them formally. I suppose none of you has looked at this formally while I was doing my talk earlier. But we can also develop a more scientific gaze or classifying gaze. I mean, I've done this kind of demonstration a few times already, so I know a couple of microphones in Europe and other parts of the world where I did this, and I must say I've never seen one with this red line. This is very specific to Serbia. But it's also it's very beautiful. I can't read the monochord. No, I've never had a monochord. So, but I mean, my point is, you start seeing these things differently. You start looking at them from a formal, aesthetic, or scientific perspective, and you deduct meaning. You draw meaning basically deductively out of this object, right? Which is a certain technique, and a very different technique from understanding it as part of the context, like when I was talking there, yeah, as part of a network of use, for instance. And this points us to the core gesture of the exhibition form. The exhibited object is an X minus exhibited object. I don't know if any of you speak German. Ausgestellt. Yeah, it's like it's an object that is taken out of its context. Like we spoke about the altar painting earlier, right? I mean, the altar painting that is part of an altar is not exhibited. It's embedded. It's part of a religious ceremony. It's part of a belief system, which is the religious belief system. It's part of an environment. It has its fixed place in there. It cannot be removed. It cannot be somewhere else. It becomes exhibited by being detached from that structure and put it to the museum. So the act of exhibiting is preceded by an act of separation. Now you could say this is different from contemporary art, and yes, there is, but ontologically, ontology is like the philosophy of like being, right? Ontologically, we understand the artwork, the art object, as something that is separated from context of use and function and as a distinct entity. This is valid for all works that you see here in the exhibition. It is, by definition, part of the idea of art, our idea of art. So why am I placing so much emphasis on this idea of detaching or separating or taking out of context? Because it's also the fundamental principle of a modern liberalist ideology. Liberalism, essentially. I mean, it comes from like 17th century British philosophy and so on, political theory, but I mean, in a nutshell, it carries the belief that separation is something emancipatory. The German sociologist Ulrich Beck, who passed away some years ago, was once asked, what does individualization mean? And his reply was, he said, it means the moment where, when I'm asked who I am, I say, I am Dorothea. I don't say, I'm the wife of, or I'm Catholic, or I'm Swiss, or I'm, whatever. I don't answer by mentioning my belongings. Two, I answer by saying, I am I. And what defines me is not the belonging to, but it's the being separated from. This is the liberalism's ideology, that this detachment is something emancipatory. It's something, it means to detach from bonds, from bondings that were in feudal times and pre-modern times experienced as being too rigid. Like for agricultural societies was a liberation to invent machines that could make people independent from nature, right? Which then allowed an increase of productivity, which allowed to use nature as, Heidegger would say, Bestand, as standing reserve, to exploit nature, which allowed to drive Western civilization into something like affluence, right? Like an enormous productivity. So this idea of separation as a driving force, as a modus operandi, as a mode of operation, has been extremely successful. Like politically, it drove, it meant to liberate from pre-modern, feudal, very rigid social ties. Intellectually, it, triggered Enlightenment thinking and all these kind of things. Economically, I just mentioned. So it's been extremely successful, and it's in its core sort of implemented into this format. Yeah? Think of the white cube. I mean, this is here not the really white cubish environment, but upstairs more. Like the white cube is essentially a separated space, right? Not only because objects are isolated, but it's also a space that is, regulating everything outside that is unwanted. Like nature is separated from culture, temperature is regulated, humidity is regulated. Everything is this belief that you can leave things out that don't belong here. It's the white, seemingly neutral space, but even in the sense of perception, usually it's when you look around here, it's the sense of vision that is highlighted, not the other senses. The sense of vision is a distancing sense, as Georg Simmel, the German sociologist, has said, right? So on different levels, we can, there are in early times of the museums, they made caricatures of peasants, of countryside people who came to the big city and kneeled down in front of artworks. They kneeled down in front of Madonnas. They were in museums for the first time, they didn't know. Were they made fun of? Because they didn't understand this idea of separation. There's a Madonna, you kneel down, you pray. They are connected. They are not judging. You don't judge something you're connected to. You judge something that you feel independent from, right? So it's a thought style that is very, very deeply characterizing the driving principle and the mode of operation of modern Western civilizations. Okay, so what has happened on the level of the format? Actually, not that much. It's because I'm kind of like still speaking to you. But what I wanted to point at, you have to follow me imagining this now. Imagine this was a proper exhibition and we would just walk through. What would have changed then? What changes is the setup. The lecture is the format of the one, me speaking to the many, you. We are still in this, but if this was a proper exhibition, you would just walk through. It wouldn't be the one speaking to the many. It would kind of be the many, you communicating to each other, but through these objects. And this is a much more multi-directional way of communication than the one that speaks to the many, which is the format of the theater, with the format of the church, but not the format of the museum. Historically, all cultural formats were based, all cultural rituals and formats were based on the one that speaks to the many. And it took centuries to change this into the much more liberal, open format of the individuals walking around freely every time everyone comes and goes as they leave. You decide yourself, I like this painting, I don't like this. I'm more interested in the table and less interested in the jacket, or the other way around. I mean, that's a much more individualized and flexibilized idea of culture than the theater, where you're in, doors closed, and you stay unless you want to make a huge drama, leaving the chair when you're right stuck in the middle, until when the play is over, right? And so historically, all cultural formats were in the one that speaks to the many, and it's not a coincidence that it's the visual art form that invented this other field. Why? What is the difference in encountering an object or encountering a human being? The object doesn't talk back. The object doesn't demand a particular, to invest a particular time. It doesn't demand a particular form of attention or focus. You can walk past by. A theatre play has a fixed beginning and end. It's just structurally not possible. So in the early times of museums, museums were one of the few places in societies where members from different social classes could meet. Without meeting, without having to talk to each other, they could meet in sharing the experience of the same artwork, but still without a direct contact. That was a very liberalizing, you could say, form of social encounter that didn't exist in many places in these societies. So for this early civil society, the material thing, the object, was a medium of liberalization, of democratization, you could say. So the strength of this format is its liberal character. Yeah? I mean, this is what it was invented for, historically, and this is what it can cultivate. On many levels, this idea of separation, this idea of detachment as something emancipatory, this idea of like giving everyone the same, it's his or her own forms of using this format. This is the strength of this format. It's being so attuned to the mindset, to the thought style of modern Western liberal thinking. The question, and this is now the last part of my presentation here, the problem, we could say, is that our lives have changed and are changing today. We are less interested in continuing this path of progressive liberalization, and more and more interested in thinking new modes of bringing all these things that modernity has separated right back together. Nature, culture, objects and their use, networks, individuals and social networks, all these belief systems of modernity, individualization and so on, detachment, separation, more and more become more and more problematic for many reasons. Ethical reasons, moral reasons, social reasons, but also ecological reasons that make it more and more necessary to think and to cultivate a new thinking in modes of connectivity, relatedness. The question is, what kind of relatedness? What kind of connectivity do we want to live but also cultivate? And the question, and this is really an open question for me, and I think not only for me, but the search movements that takes place in institutions in the 21st century at the moment, the question is, can the format of the exhibition be the right testing ground for this. Why? Because the format that historically, and I mean I spent the last hour trying to make this clear, historically was geared towards liberalization, flexibilization, breaking up connectivity, can only to a certain extent now do the opposite. It's just going against the grain of this format in a certain way, right? Which I think explains pretty much where we are at today. On the one hand, the field of art is a field that allows for many things, right? It allows for bringing people to do different kinds of research on extremely interesting topics, presenting it in different ways than in academic context or public context or education, purely educational context. So it has a relative large amount of freedom, it gets a lot of attention, and it still has some resources. The format, on the other hand, that this field offers seem more and more not enough, or in its conventionality and rigidity, not really fitting anymore to what people want to do in art today. And I'm on purpose putting this in very vague terms because I don't think it has been articulated very precisely and reflectively, and it happens a lot subconsciously. Like as Bea mentioned, I've been working on Documenta for many years, and like the past 5 Documenta curators. So since Katrin David did Documenta in 1997, which is more than 20 years ago, they were all embracing the idea of Documenta because it's 900,000 visitors. It's the biggest art exhibition you can do. It's amazing to become the Documenta curator. But they all said, we don't want to do an exhibition. Like they called it differently. Like she said, we do a manifestation culturelle in her twisted French way of putting things. And they created conferences and discourse platforms and all kinds of things. But always struggled with the necessity to also having to do an exhibition. And I think this ambivalent relation to the format that is in the process of fundamentally reinventing itself. And the reason it needs to do this reinvention is not for the sake of exhibitions, but because the socioeconomic and order underlying it is so dramatically changing. And this is what I wanted to point at. We need to reinvent this format because we also need to reinvent the socio-economic order that this format always has reflected, always has mirrored, and continues to do so. And I want to end with a little homage to an artwork from many, many years ago by German young artist Kirsten Piroth, who once showed a puddle in an exhibition, and this is an homage to her because it shows, it reminds me or alludes for me to a different idea of inseparable connectedness, sort of. Thank you very much for your attention.
So any questions, or would you like to respond, or?
But you speak very eloquently, and you're an expert. I'm a layman. But to me, the job of a curator is the opposite of what you claim, not to isolate and individualize objects, but to bring them in interesting and revealing and suggestive and fresh relationships. To me, the most satisfying aspect of a really good show is establishment of aesthetic, maybe historical connections among the individual artworks that I could not appreciate while I saw them in different places.
Yeah, but You're right. What I'm interested in is the necessity to construct, I mean, as you said, it needs this narrative, because otherwise the things would just stand for themselves meaningless, right? And this ontological understanding of that the other as such is a meaningless, in the worst case, distinct object that has no relation, that needs the narrative of the curator, who then could almost become like a quasi-artist or author, which also has not been criticized in the last decades. Huh? Is very interesting, because precisely because it's not enough to have these objects as such anymore, which in sort of high modernism was the case. I mean, really, like in high modernist theory, the idea is that I stare at this and something transcending happens. But it doesn't. So it needs these narratives. This is already, you could say, the beginning of questioning the core of this format, which is isolated. The emphasis on the narrative. The question for me is, okay, the narrative of a curator is one form to create context, to create sense and meaning. What are others? That do not work through language or raw text or, the narrative of the curator. What could be others? But I mean, I see your point, but I think the emphasis on the narrative is already a step away from the, at least sort of, peak of this format in modernity.
Well, just for the sake of friendly argument,
Yeah.
I don't expect a narration or a narrative. Narrative is sort of a trendy word. I expect interesting interplay. Because the narrative implies a sequence, a one-dimensional development. In a good exhibition, I want a network, an interplay. I want individual artworks to sort themselves out into layers, not necessarily into layers of quality, but in layers of meaning. I want all of this to happen, and I'm willing to give the curator the credit for making it possible, but I do not want to see it, I do not want the curator, no matter how expert and how articulate, to be too didactical and too present. Just like a great architect, I want to feel good I want to appreciate the building without seeing any sign of the architect. In an exhibition, I want to benefit from all the expertise and all the insights of the curator, but I want the curator in the background. So I think the word narrative is very trendy, and I don't like it. Because I don't like narrative art. Art that painstakingly tells you something, it's boring, right? You don't want a cartoon. You want meaningful, layered, surprising, revealing art.
And how often do you see an exhibition that you really that fulfills that?
Not in Belgrade.
No, but I mean, what you described, I mean, fair enough. And I think I went, as I told someone today earlier, I went last Sunday. We in Berlin opened in the Martin Bundesbahn Berlin, which is a museum there, opened an exhibition on the Golit case. Golit was that was a very much debated thing in the media some years ago, because an art collection showed up a few years ago, which originated from an art dealer who had collaborated with the Nazis, but also supported the avant-garde artists. So a bit of a shady figure. Supporting avant-garde artists, but also selling works that the artists, that the Nazis had discredited in their degenerated art exhibition to foreign countries and taking it away from Jewish owners and collectors and so on. 1,500 works that showed up a few years ago, and now the question what to do with them. Huge research projects on the provenance, and so last Sunday the exhibition that documents this whole case was opened. And I went, and I'm going Friday with my students, and it's a classical, traditional exhibition in the best sense. It's extremely, beautiful expressionist artworks, also Rodin sculptures, like an amazing collection of artworks, but also extremely educational in that you really understand how the Nazis used art and how art was instrumentalized for this political regime, and how these structures operated, and how they still, for decades, this art collection could be hidden, exist somewhere hidden, without being discovered. So I completely support the existence and the continuous existence of these kinds of exhibitions. What interests me, and I'm convinced that these things will exist at the same time and continue to exist, is the more, let's say, avant-garde speculation about, okay, this format has, at its best, produced this kind of culture. And as I said, I'm deeply convinced that this is right. It's the strength of this format results in mirroring and reflecting a certain belief system of the 19th and 20th century. To which extent do we hold on to this belief system in the 21st century, and to which extent do we not? And in which way does this change our approach to this format? And I think that very few people in the world, curators or artists, are able to invent a format that might seem more corresponding, in an avant-garde sense maybe, to our time. When I go through and I've heard this from many people, they go through a place like this, and they think, oh, this is nice, but it's so 20th century. What does that mean? And if this is the case, and many people say this about MoMA in New York, or the big 20th century museums that had a lot of cultural authority at that time, and they somehow lost it today. Why? And if this is so, then what is the institution or the format that corresponds to our time? And I don't think we can answer this in 2018, but I think it's the most interesting research or search movement taking place at the moment, and a lot of people who kind of work on this go into this direction, whether they analyze it in the way I do, or make it explicit or reflect it in the way I do, or not. Any other comments or questions?
I think, is it a problem format of exhibitions, or even of each artwork? Because artwork somehow need to be exhibited, and then it's the same relation with viewer and author.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think ultimately, of course, the idea of art is closely tied to the idea of the museum, no? And I in the last 20 years have been most interested in artists that don't even make exhibitions in the classical sense. They don't even produce an object and give it to the curator, and then the curator puts it on a pedestal like this, right? They create the entire format themselves. And they don't produce these distinct works, but they think in terms of spatial arrangements. And I think of people like Pierre Wieg or Philippe Areno, or so that have been informative and important for me, a bit of older generation than you. Or other artists also. Dominique González First is showing an exhibition in Leipzig. Soon in Germany. Anyway, so I'm very interested, and my thinking is very informed by artists to question the notion of the object, but also the format of the exhibition themselves. Because precisely I agree that you cannot really separate the one from the other. Understand?
Yes, I'm just thinking about the artist. Like, still the artist exists, and we need to see this artist like a person who shows us objects or ideas. For me, it's the same line of meanings and ways of thinking.
Yeah. Same as what?
As the exhibition.
Yeah.
Because we still look at one person, like individuals. Even if we participate in one group, in a group, in community, there is one person who is an artist.
But I mean, this is, these conventions are extremely strong. I mean, so many artists have tried to break this up, you know, to work in collectives, to disappear, to experiment with that. It's extremely difficult because the artwork is so focused on the idea of the individual, so they will always point to the individual creator. And it's extremely difficult to overcome this. And you know, when it comes to the question of applying for grants or getting money, you wouldn't be able. It's almost impossible to get money if there is not this individual, this hero, this artistic genius, you know, somehow involved. No? If it's a genius or not doesn't matter, but just the idea that this needs to be present. And of course you can say, yeah, but it's very, very difficult to move away from that.
Yes, that's what I was thinking, because if we want to experiment, we need to separate ourselves from capital, and how long can we experiment with this?
Yes, but I mean, you wouldn't be the first one who tries to do this. The question is only, like, do you do this, like, in your little backyard garden for yourself, or do you want to do this within the structures that are there? And if you do this within the structures that are given, institutions, market, money givers, you have to work with these conventions, and you cannot simply negate them. I mean, if you can, on the long run, it doesn't really work. I mean, this we can learn from previous generations who tried this. Unless you decide, okay, I'm happy with my little backyard artist or curator existence, and I do my things there, and no one messes with my ideas. This is also fine. Otherwise, I think there's no alternative to trying to gain agency in operating with these conventions. And it's a very difficult work, and success comes in small amounts, but it is possible to change, to insert slight changes into these conventions.
To see such changes, can you think of concrete examples later where this is beginning to happen?
I mean, I see, you know, a lot happening in institutions. I mean, we can speak about this craze about live artworks and dance pieces in museums. That has started about 20 years ago, and at that time it was an almost impossible endeavor, you know, to show something. I mean, this has happened in the 70s already, but very, very marginal, and decidedly, I mean, these people like Marina Abramović and so on, they did what they did, and they wanted to stay outside of these conventions. I mean, they wanted to be outside of the market and outside of the museum. And now in retrospect, they said, you know, it was a little bit naive, because first of all, they also needed to live, and they needed some kind of income, and also what entered these museums were not the works in itself, but the documentation of it. So Marina said she learned a lot from younger generation who tries again to insert body-based works, not object-based works, in museums and also in museum collections. And this first happened very marginally. And now, you know, museums are even thinking about collecting these works, which really changes the idea of a collection.
Sorry, can you be more concrete? Because I'm not sure if the audience.
Now, Tate Modern, for instance, is establishing a fund now to collect live artworks. Tate Modern and Hantelmann.
It's like finance that they're doing the Tate.
Yes, they do a series of live exhibitions. They call it live exhibition. I'm not saying that this is qualitatively necessarily good. I haven't even seen the first one, but it's an interesting phenomenon. That one of the biggest museums is starting to organize a fund, so money, to buy live artworks as part of their collection. Not as a marginal, small, experimental thing, but really on a big scale. Because that comes with, I mean, that changes the museum structure completely. What happens to documentation, what happens to conservation? How do you, like when the performer dies, what happens to the collected work? It doesn't, like all these questions that go with it, you know, that really mean changes of the idea of a collection. That's one example.
So it's basically a fund that collects not the documentation of the live-based work, but
Yes.
the live work
Yes.
in
Yes.
different ways through the instructions or.
Yeah, I mean, like to make it a bit more, to give you a bit more context. So, Tate Modern is an interesting example because some years, 10 years ago, as I remember, they started to build new museum spaces, the so-called tanks. And the interesting thing about the museum, these spaces, is that they are exhibition spaces, but at the same time, spaces for live art, dance, for instance. So imagine a museum exhibition space that also has a shower and a changing room attached to it. You wouldn't find this here. I mean, most museums have lecture rooms.
Maybe the shower is part of the exhibition also.
No, it isn't.
No, good, good.
But I mean, most museums have lecture rooms, right, for talks, occasionally also for a performance or something. But usually these rooms were always in the basement, somewhere hidden. So then the Contemporary Art Museum, in its center, builds two large rooms that are dedicated to visual art, but also to live art, performance, dance. Was new at that time. And at the same time, they asked dancers, also known dancers from the dance world, like Teresa de Casmacher, for instance, a Belgian choreographer, but also others, to show dance works in the museum. Okay, they've done this for a few years, and then the question came up, so we should have this in our collection. So how do we buy a dance piece? How is it then reshown? And I mean, all these questions, you know, like what's dance up to this point doesn't have a private market. So there are blurrings between formats, live art and exhibitions. It's the blurring of the exhibition format and the live performance or theater format, which start to change the institutions also. Is it not clear now?
How do you do it then?
Well,
Buying the dance.
Well, you should invite Catherine Wood and ask her. She's in charge of this. I'm not. So
But I guess that's part of the idea. It cannot be commodified. It cannot, Exactly.
Everything
Well,
can be commodified.
no, I mean it's
Whenever you buy a ticket for a ballet performance, you have bought a temporary appreciation of an artist.
But this
It's
is
so obvious.
so interesting what you're saying. Temporary appreciation of an artwork. It's a completely different mindset from I own this. It's a temporary. It's a very nice. Thank you. It's a very nice. No, it's really nice way of putting it. Yes, I mean, what the museum buys when it buys a performance piece or a live art piece is the right. It cannot buy it physically. So in that sense, it cannot be reified. It buys the right to show it, and usually there's a contract explaining who is allowed and authorized to install the piece. You know, they cannot do it somehow, right? Like, there are people who are trained, who have this knowledge in their body to show these works, to train other people to show it. But it's of course a different apparatus. And yes,
It's very clear explanation. Traditional ownership of a material object is exclusive. If I own it, then you don't. And if you want to acquire it, then I have to lose it. Ownership of intellectual property or of artistic creation is opposite. It becomes the property of its maker only when it becomes accepted by others. Right? If I publish a scientific study,
why does it become the property of its maker only by being shared?
okay, I'm giving you an example.
Please.
If, let's say, 3 of us make a scientific discovery in our laboratory and nobody knows about it, it's not ours. When we publish it so that the world knows about it, when we give it away, then it becomes credited to us. So, you're talking of a kind of property or ownership which is only seemingly paradoxical in becoming credited to its author only when the author gives it away freely to the world. Now, the example that you give is even more difficult because you're talking not of the performer of the ballet art or dance art, you're talking of a third party, a museum, an institution that wants to buy it. It will not be possible. This attempt will fail for the reasons I mentioned. You cannot individualize intellectual property. You cannot individualize artistic or any creative, any idea, anything that embodies an idea is either unknown and therefore property only of its secret creator, or it is widely shared, belongs to everybody, and therefore becomes truly the property of its own.
Yeah, I would phrase it a little differently. I think, first of all, how this will develop, we will see, and the question is not how it develops in the next 5 years, but how about the next 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years? I mean, and this is the interesting thing about museums, that they think in larger time spans. Also.
What I presented you has existed for centuries.
Yes, but
nothing will happen in 10 years that will invalidate this.
But it's just the attempt of trying to sell it isn't like commodifying it, because it's the same as conceptual art. At the beginning, they didn't know. For example, in Villa Panza, there is like a wide collection of conceptual art. And in the beginning, they didn't know how to buy and sell conceptual art. So they developed the contract, they were saying the words, how it would be exhibited. And that was the ownership of a sentence. But of course, I remember the sentences of a Florence Fanner piece, but that doesn't mean that it belongs to me, just because I know about it. And I know how a fridge works, but I don't.
I mean, I don't know if we really communicate at the moment, or if we all three of us talk about different things. But just to finish, like what I can say about the museum practices, yes, they are, let's say, experimenting with buying these things, but this project is in so far unsuccessful at the moment, at least, because, and there I think we're on the same page. The question is not can they buy it or not, because yes, everything can be bought, and if you like it or not, and if you think this is a problem or not, it's a completely different question. But of course you can, as long as somebody, like two people agree to sell and buy it, everything can be bought or sold.
It can be paid for.
No.
It can be paid for.
No, can I finish?
If you pay for something, doesn't mean you bought it.
Can I finish? The question is, an artwork only survives if it's shared, if it's shown. The question is, are these works ever going to be shown again? Because most of these works so far haven't been. and then they die. I mean, this can also happen to works, and many artworks disappear in museum storages for decades without ever being shown. But the showing of the re-showing of a painting is way easier than the re-showing of a live art piece. Especially then, imagine in 50 years, who will know how to present this? And there I do see a problem. But on the other hand, you know, if you look to other art fields like famous like dance, famous choreographers, Balanchine. He's dead for a long time. His works are still shown. There's a Balanchine trust. I mean, there's like people who know, have the knowledge about these works, and they pass it on. So of course it's possible. In other art fields, there's also examples for this. So of course it's possible to keep these things alive somehow, but they need to be reshown and they need to be shared in order to survive. I mean, I would agree.
I have a sociological question. In the beginning, you explained the emergence of a museum.
Yes.
And, I have a suspicion in a different direction.
Okay.
But there were private collections back in 15th, 16th centuries. Rich people had their private collections. Beginning late 18th century, there's a democratization in European societies. The urge for collecting is inherent in people and has existed in every society, in every culture. So isn't the emergence of a museum a way of democratizing the collecting urge? Now in 18th, 19th centuries, something becomes available to ordinary citizens, which previously in feudalistic times were available only to the rich and powerful.
Yeah, but why is this contradicting what I said?
No, well, not, you're right, not really contradicting, but just I'm emphasizing more of a sociological aspect.
Of course, the desire to collect, yes, is universally ubiquitous. There are different forms of collecting, and there probably is such a specificity to the modern Western way of collecting, but yes, I mean, the fact that the National Gallery, the idea of the nation, a place where the nation meets, you cannot bring all members of the nation in the same space at the same time. So you have to invent a new form of bringing the nation together. And the nation, and my interest is like, what is this new form? And interestingly, it becomes a temple. These 19th century museums do look like temples, of objects, collections, and very particular individualized and flexibilized forms of encountering them. This is a specific form, and nation on top, National Gallery, National Gallery. So this is the setting. It could also be a different one, but this is the one that I'm interested in. It incorporates, it implements this desire for collecting. Yes.
Thank you, Dorothea.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to announce our next public lecture will be on 26th at the Museum of Contemporary Art, who is hosting all our public lectures, and Senka, who is really helping us on a project from the museum. The 26th lecture will be by Antariksa, who is the co-founder of the Kunci Cultural Studies Center in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, which is a very interesting institutional format. So he's going to share his experience working as a co-founder and the director of Kunci. So it's going to be on 26th at the same time at 6 p.m. right here. And I just forgot to thank Saša for making a second slide. Saša is part of our project. Saša Tkačenko who did also visual identity of the curatorial program, but he's also trying to, he's attempting to follow our project through his art project that is evolving. So this is the second flag, and you will see the third flag next week. So thank you all for coming, and I hope I see you next week. We will have these weekly lectures very intensively till mid of November. Thank you.